Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate you being inside on such a beautiful evening, even if it's a little smoky out there. So, almost a year ago, on September 14th, amid great fanfare, we unveiled the Tibetan Shrine, which was a gift from New Yorker Alice Candell. And I think, I get started there. Here we are. I think you're all familiar with it by now. Having worked for over a year with representatives from the Tibetan America Foundation of Minnesota, we could at last welcome community members to join in this momentous occasion, which included performances, the construction of a green Tara sand mandala by members of the Jancheng Choling Nunnery in India, and a lecture by Thupten Jimpa Langri, the longtime translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Throughout the last year, we've had the honor of hosting numerous events, including a hands-on butter sculpture making class by members of the Yuto Monastery, a painting demonstration by a local Tanka painter, a poetry reading and book signing by Tibetan poet Bunchang Sonam, and a wonderful family day featuring Tibetan chanting. And here, in this slide, our audience enjoyed the remarkable talents by a group of young musicians from the Cultural School at the Tibetan American Foundation of Minnesota. Other events have centered on presentations by august professors like Dr. Donald Lopez from the University of Michigan, who is, there in the center next to Alice. And most recently, we were able to host an illuminating panel discussion on the topic of death, dying, and resilience in Buddhist art and practice with Drupa Rinpoche and Professor Tenzin Namdul from the University of Minnesota. Tonight, then, represents the 7th program in our Year of Tibet, but I'd like to take a moment to especially acknowledge and applaud the members of our Tibetan community who have been so helpful in planning and promoting and organizing these programs around the Tibetan Shrine. If we could give them a hand, I think there are a few of us now. I also can't be remiss in not recognizing our own Virajita Singh, who's down here in the front row, our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, who's also been the conduit to the Tibetan community. So tonight, it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Benjamin Bogin to MIA. Dr. Bogin is an Associate Professor of Asian Studies at Skidmore College in Sarasota Springs, New York. He received his MA and PhD in Buddhist Studies from the University of Michigan and spent 6 years living in Kathmandu, where he directed the Study Abroad program for American students. Dr. Bogin writes and teaches on the intersection of biographical literature, sacred geography, and visual art in Himalayan cultures. He has authored and edited many works, including the recent publication of Forms of Awakening, Tibetan Art from the Jack Shear collection, as well as the Illuminated Life of the Great Yolmowa, as well as Himalayan Passages, Tibetan and Newar Studies in honor of Hubert Decleer. From this evening's presentation, it seems altogether fitting to focus on contemporary artists today and their connection to the past, both inside and outside the geographic space of Tibet. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Bogin.
Thanks so much. It's truly a great honor to be here at MIA, and in fact, in Minneapolis. It's my first time here. And in just 24 hours, I can already see that there are many, many options of activities you might be enjoying outdoors in this beautiful city on a summer night. So I'm very grateful to all of you for choosing to spend this time with me contemplating contemporary art from the Tibetan world. I'd like to thank Matthew, of course, for the invitation to participate in this series, and Alice Candell for the generous gift that really prompted this series focused on Tibet. In the many years that I've been involved with the Tibetan community, I've heard again and again about what a vital role the Tibetan community of the Twin Cities plays in the life of the Tibetan diaspora more broadly. And don't tell my friends in Jackson Heights in New York, but some people would really probably consider Minnesota the heart of North American Tibetan cultural life. So I'm really honored to be here with all of you. I should also admit that beyond being very honored to present, I'm also a little nervous about this presentation because my own training and scholarly research has really focused on Tibetan Buddhist literature and history between the 12th and 17th centuries. Contemporary art from the Tibetan world is a rather new area for me, and this is in fact my first public lecture on the topic. So I hope you'll bear with me and be forgiving. It's something that I find vitally important and truly fascinating. I'm excited to share with you, but I'm by no means an expert in the topic. So I will look forward to your questions at the end of this presentation. I'm going to focus on an extraordinary work by the Tibetan artist Gade called Ice Buddha as the starting point for this lecture, and it will also be a touchstone that I'll return to at various points throughout. To me, this work embodies some of the main themes that I see as allowing us to explore the continuities between contemporary Tibetan art and traditional Tibetan artistic forms, and also the continuities that we find between work by contemporary artists in Tibet and those of the Tibetan exile community who are now spread across the world. So these photos were taken by someone named Jason Sangster in 2006, and they documented an ephemeral work of art. Gade took water from the Kichu River, the river that runs through Lhasa, Tibet's capital, and he poured it into a mold that was based on a traditional Buddha image and froze that water into an ice form of the Buddha, and then placed that ice sculpture back into the Kichu River, where it slowly melted back into the water that was its source originally. According to eyewitness accounts of the event, it was quite a festive atmosphere. Gade and his artist friends gathered in the great Tibetan pastime of what's called linka, or picnicking, sitting by the banks of the river and enjoying food and drink and playing games while the ice Buddha melted away. Various critics and viewers of this artwork have interpreted it in many different ways. And Gade himself in interviews has referred to the openness to many interpretations of this particular work as one of the virtues of the work itself. I've taught my students at Skidmore College this work, and I'm always amazed to see how many different responses students have. Some see it as a work that's really addressing the disappearance of Tibetan Buddhist culture under the occupation of the People's Republic of China. Some see it as a commentary on climate change. Some see it as a Buddhist exploration of impermanence or of the cyclical nature of life as the water goes through different modes and different forms. And all of these, of course, are possible readings, and the density of these meanings all within this one work is part of what makes it such a successful work of art in my estimation. Before I expand on my discussion of this work, I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about how I did come to be interested in contemporary art and the nature of my involvement. So in the spring of 2020, which you may recall was the beginning of the global COVID-19 pandemic, I received a phone call from the director of the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore College. And he said, there's a donor who is interested in giving his collection of Tibetan Thangka paintings to the college, and asked if I would be willing to drive the hour out to this collector's house to take a look at the paintings and see if they might be something we might want to accept. So this is what I found when I drove out there. There are a number of very extraordinary pieces among this collection. But in that moment, in 2020, my mind, as the minds of many people, were focused on questions of social justice, of the legacies of colonialism, and the ethics of representation of Tibet and Tibetan art. I was acutely aware that most of these Thangka paintings were probably either stolen or purchased in transactions that would not pass any real ethical register of how they were. The collector had acquired them from reputable auction houses, but the provenance of Tibetan Thangka paintings has been obscured over time. And there is ample documentation of the looting of Tibetan monasteries. Even those Thangkas that were brought by refugees who escaped into Nepal and India and then sold them for their livelihood, they were in circumstances where saying that it was really their own choice is much more complex than it might be suggested. So the first thing that I said to the museum director was, you need to think really carefully about what it would mean to accept these, to take this gift. Here's a picture. You can, it's easily dated by the fact that I'm wearing latex gloves and a homemade mask. It's very early in the pandemic as I was looking at one of the Thangka paintings and thinking about some of these questions. That started a series of really productive conversations. First of all, I really encouraged the museum director to reach out to members of the Tibetan community to discuss it. We also looked to the guidance offered by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Dengse Gyatso, who has said on numerous occasions that until it's possible for Tibetan artworks to be returned to Tibet in conditions where they would be safe, it might be best for museums and educational institutions to preserve them and make them available for teaching and research in various ways. And so we developed a plan to create a series of exhibitions where we would work together with members of the Tibetan community and publish a book. So after discussing those, here's a view of the exhibition that was at Skidmore College. The gift actually ended up being shared by 3 colleges, Vassar College, Williams College, and Skidmore College, and each institution created their own exhibition based on those materials. And I was asked to be one of the co-curators of the version at Skidmore. And this was my first curatorial experience, something that I found really eye-opening and challenging and exhilarating in many different ways. Just now, this month, a book has been published called Forms of Awakening, Tibetan Art from the Jack Shear Collection that documents the gift, these 3 different exhibitions, and then has essays about some of these concerns, questions about how museums historically have dealt with materials from the Himalayas and suggestions about how we might move forward. In a lot of areas, there are discussions about repatriation as one solution to the movement of these works from their homes. In the case of Tibet, repatriation is very complicated, right? It's not the same as materials that have been stolen from Nepal or from India, where the government can make formal and legal requests for repatriation. If these materials are repatriated to China, it's very likely that they will suffer the same fate again, right, and reappear on the same market. So where exactly would they be repatriated to in the absence of an internationally recognized Tibetan nation, right? So I was very pleased that this book was able to engage with some of those questions, that the museum directors were not afraid to face some of these questions, which some museum directors shy away from, and that we didn't solve any of these problems, but we had a number of workshops and discussions that were really helpful along those lines in thinking about some of these questions. We also modeled different ways of engaging with this material creatively. The Tibetan poet Tsering Dompa led a poetry workshop in the galleries. And as part of the whole project, I was very concerned that most frequently when Tibetan art is exhibited in a museum in the United States, it's seen as a relic of a lost ancient world. It's seen as something disconnected from the world that we all live in and share. And I insisted that our exhibition include works by contemporary Tibetan artists who were in conversation with the Thangka paintings from this collection. And so the book also includes documentation of the works by those contemporary artists. And it was my work with those contemporary artists that led to some of the ideas and questions that I want to discuss today. So, all right. I'm also building upon the work of art historians. As I said, I'm not myself trained as an art historian, but certainly the most important book on contemporary Tibetan art, although it dates all the way back to 1999, is Claire Harris's book, In the Image of Tibet, Tibetan Painting After 1959. I'm not going to present an art historical overview of contemporary Tibetan art today, and I wanted to recommend this book to anyone who's interested in that. Claire Harris does an excellent job of doing that in her book, so I wanted to share that. All right, back to the Ice Buddha. So in thinking about Tibetan art, one of the first questions that we need to explore is, how have Tibetans conceived of art historically? What does art mean in the context of Tibetan culture? And this, of course, is very closely connected with Buddhist philosophy, with Buddhist tradition. And many of the images in Thangka paintings and in sculptures that are found in galleries, private collections, and museums are really understood not just to be representations of something else, but to actually be living embodiments of different Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and protectors. And part of this has to do with an understanding of the nature of Buddhahood or awakening and how it can manifest in the world in different modes. And the exhibition that I helped to curate, we decided to organize the gallery in 3 different forms of awakening, as it were. The first being the landscape. So the Tibetan landscape itself is understood as a site of awakening, as a locus of awakening. There are sacred mountains, sacred rivers, sacred trees, sacred rocks, sacred caves, all of them imbued with the power of Buddhahood, with the power of awakening. The Kichu River's prominence in this painting suggests that link to and tie to the Tibetan landscape. Another work by Gade, the same artist from that same time period, 2006, is called The Demoness. Here, the Tibetan book, Becha, is used as the medium for a painting of a figure, a supine figure lying on her back, and the separation of these pages. So in a Tibetan book, these long leaves of paper would be stacked together and printed on both sides. And so when you read them, you would turn them over. Here they're spread out and laid out with space in between them, give this sense of a fragmented or fractured image. Tibetan viewers would recognize this as related to one of the most significant aspects of Tibetan civilizational myth, one of the foundational myths of Tibetan civilization. And that has to do with the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet. Buddhism came to Tibet rather late compared to the rest of Asia in the 7th century. And it's particularly associated with the reign of King Songtsen Gampo, who reigned from 614 to 648. He's represented here as the figure in the center. We know historically that he was actually a great military leader. He expanded the Tibetan Empire to the largest geographical extent in its history, temporarily even conquering Tang China to the east, all the way into what's now Afghanistan to the west, Mongolia to the north, and into Nepal, actually as far as parts of what's now India in the south. And as was custom in those days, one way to make a peace treaty in times of war was through what was called a marriage alliance. And so neighboring countries would offer a member of their royal family as a bride to the invading ruler. Here we have the princess from Nepal, Prikuti, and the Tang princess, Wencheng. And according to the Tang annals, we also have confirmation of this marital alliance. And in the stories that are told, the young princess was not very excited about this arranged marriage. In the Tang records of that time, Tibetans are described as ferocious and terrifying barbaric figures who lacked the culture and sophistication of the Tang court. Tang China had elaborate literary tradition, religious culture, science, arts, all of these different things. And the Tibetans were mostly known for their ferocity as warriors. So she was resistant to the marriage, but agreed as long as she was able to bring all of the accoutrements of courtly life with her into Tibet, including an image of the Buddha, because there was no Buddhism in Tibet. Along the way, her group, they had to travel by land all the way from the Tang capital to Lhasa. They kept encountering all kinds of difficulties, landslides, storms. The cart that was carrying the Buddha image kept sinking into the mud, and problem after problem after problem. And one of the experts in the traveling party was skilled in what was called geomancy, interpreting the landscape to sort of divine hidden meanings. And he took a look at the landscape and he said, it turns out that the entire Tibetan plateau, this whole area north of the Himalayan mountain range, is a giant demoness. And she is not interested in this foreign religion entering her territory or crossing over her body. And we'll never be able to get this Buddha image to Tibet unless we somehow pin her down. This is an old block print showing the demoness and mapping out the system of 13 Buddhist temples that had to be constructed in order to pin her down. The one at the heart is the one that became the most significant. That's the building called the Lhasa Jokang, the most sacred temple in the Tibetan Buddhist world. The demoness's heart was identified with a lake in Lhasa, and they filled the lake in with stones, and on that foundation built the temple where this Buddha image was going to be housed. And this construction of these temples and the subjugation of this demoness was what created the possibility of Buddhism taking root in Tibet, according to this story. So if we go back to Gade's image, this is clearly the reference that he's referring to. This is another painting. I've not been able to identify the artist, but this again shows the demoness. And here they've tried to, rather than just have this system of squares, identify each temple by, there were one for each knee, one for each foot, one for each hand, one for each elbow, one for each shoulder, and then the one at the heart is the Jokang. So this is trying to map it onto geographic reality. This is a subject that was also taken up by the painter Dedrun in Tibet in her painting The Conquered Enchantress of 2013. So all of these contemporary expressions of this story are emphasizing again the transformation of the Tibetan landscape and the complexities of what's involved in that process. This work, again by Gade, the same artist who made the Ice Buddha, is called Lhasa Train, and it was a response to the construction of a rail line going from mainland China, from Beijing, all the way to Lhasa for the first time. It was celebrated in China as a great feat of engineering because it was a high altitude train that much of the rail had to be laid in permafrost areas. But for Tibetans in Tibet, it was seen as an acceleration of the extraction of natural resources and an acceleration of the migration of Han Chinese into Tibetan areas and the further dissolution of Tibetan language, Tibetan culture in the face of the encroachment of Han Chinese culture and modernity. So this artwork explores that. Here are a couple of details that show that closely. Referring to this work, Gade said this. This is from an interview with the artist. Nowadays, Tibet has lots of changes brought by the West and the East too. Our generation is a time when we experience this the most and see the effects from all of these changes. In my painting, you can see lots of things like Disneyland, a China mobile signboard, Coca-Cola signboards, which are seen by us every day in our lives. Tibet has gone through a cultural revolution and now commercialism. So now Tibetan culture has become some sort of a circus center or a resort center where you can see everything. Some things are very foreign, almost extraterrestrial. All of these changes are not brought only by the train, but the train plays the role of instigator and is a focus point. So now we cannot place our identity in a fixed area, as there are too many things that have happened. And we feel this loss of identity, and maybe we are the only generation to experience such a thing. So it's interesting to me, these are two stories about foreign intrusions into Tibet and transformations of the Tibetan landscape. One is celebrated throughout Tibetan history as a positive change, the introduction of Buddhism. And here there's one that is viewed much more critically and with a sense of loss. I'm going to move now to work by a young Tibetan American artist named Tenzin Punso. I encountered this work by chance walking in Chelsea in New York City, and I went into a small gallery called the Microscope Gallery, where an exhibition of Tenzin Punso's work was on display in 2022. The central piece in that exhibition, which was called Pure Land, is a 15-minute single-channel video work that was shot on 35mm film. And it's a short 15-minute experimental film that is really looking at the artist's own longing for the Tibetan landscape and the Tibetan homeland. He had earlier attempted to make a film called Four Rivers, which was a proposed documentary where he was going to visit the sources of 4 different rivers that originate from Mount Kailash in Western Tibet. But he was not allowed entry into China. He was stopped at the border and he was not able to complete the project himself. He sent his director of photography along with precise notes, and the film was actually made based on his instructions, but Tenzin Punso was not able to go himself. He was born in exile and grew up entirely in America and has never been to Tibet. And he is someone who is almost defined by this sense of longing to go to Tibet. In this work, Pure Land, he filmed the entire piece in Montana. And he found an area where the landscape was very reminiscent of the Tibetan landscape. And in the short film, you see an actor who's playing sort of a version of Tenzin Punso, traveling around this landscape, taking pictures, and calling his mother on his cell phone. And he's describing what he's seeing, and she's telling him about Tibet. And it's almost as if he's trying to find in the landscape of the American West, of the plains of Montana, trying to find something as close as he possibly can to the homeland that he's not able to visit in person. I found the piece very powerful, moving, very evocative of the conditions of exile, the sense of longing, and the centrality of landscape itself to Tibetan identity. I was fortunate that we were able to include this work in the exhibition that I curated at the Tang. These are a few still shots from the installation at Microscope Gallery in New York City. In this shot, you can see that there's another work displayed here, which was from a series that Tenzin Punso created based on the Tibetan Gao, or amulet box. Here, he installed a small screen, cell phone screens in a box that have short videos that play on a loop in them. This piece, Summer Grass, shows scenes that were transmitted between Tenzin Putsok's family in the United States and their relatives in Kham in eastern Tibet. And these were over WeChat, the social media platform, which shortly after he filmed these was actually blocked and taken down, and further disrupted the connection to their life back home. The woman here is actually the artist's aunt, and she's sending a message to her sister about her longing to see her, and sitting in a pasture and in a meadow. Again, very powerfully evoking the landscape. There are also footage of grazing yaks and sort of family celebration inside of a house there. So this work, although it's made by a Tibetan American artist who's never been to Tibet, also foregrounds the Tibetan landscape in a very powerful way, and wrestles with some of the same questions that artists like Gade and Daedron are wrestling with from inside Tibet at the same time. So that's just a couple of artists who exemplify this interest in landscape. Another element of these photographs of Ice Buddha, of course, is this building in the back, right? And you probably, many of you recognize, although this is a view that is not typically seen, that this is, of course, the Potala Palace, the residence of the Dalai Lamas. It was built in the 17th century initiated during the reign of the fifth Dalai Lama, who Tibetans call Ngabachempo, the great fifth Dalai Lama, because of his great importance to the development of Tibet itself. So architecture is another place where Buddhahood or awakening can manifest in the world, can take form, whether it's the potala or in structures known as chorten in Tibetan or stupa in Sanskrit, that are physical architectural representations of enlightenment. So here's a stupa from Tuling Monastery in the far west of Tibet that dates to the early 11th century. This is another area where we see contemporary artists, both inside and outside of Tibet, exploring these forms in their own work. So this is work from 2010 that was called Arak Stupa by an artist known as Yap Tseten and another artist, Tsekel. And they constructed this stupa based on the formal qualities of the traditional stupa, but entirely out of beer bottles from the Lhasa beer company. So arak means alcohol. So this is like the beer stupa. You can see it close up here. They constructed this, and it was there only for 3 days in an area of Tibet called Damshung, way up in the plains, a very remote area. The only people who saw it were probably some yak herders who happened to go by there. Of course, they documented it with photographs. Here's a view from a bit further away. You can see them working on it from a distance and what it looked like on the landscape. And here's Yaktseten, the primary artist who was involved in the construction of this image. Interestingly, this attracted some attention, and it was included in a major exhibition of contemporary Tibetan art at a Beijing art gallery in 2010. That was called The Scorching Sun of Tibet. That was really a landmark exhibition. I'm really struck by how different it looks inside of a gallery space compared to in the Tibetan landscape. It's almost a completely different object, completely different work. But one of the most prominent and important critics of contemporary art in China wrote about this piece after seeing it in Beijing. This is Li Xianting, said, "Modern culture, consumerism, and secularism are eroding Tibetan culture, creating a kind of cultural mishmash and a shattered landscape. Yat-Seten and Segel's beer bottle stupa symbolizes this cultural transformation, which actually starts from foodways." So here, this is being read as a critique of the sort of destruction of Tibetan culture. And that's certainly a possible reading. On the other hand, I think that it's also possible to read this as an exploration of the resilience of Tibetan culture and of the fact that even in the face of all of this extraordinary change through colonization and modernization, it's possible to maintain some of these traditional forms in new ways, right? Again, an interesting exploration of architecture. Meanwhile, this is an installation view from the Forms of Awakening exhibition that I worked on. And in this corner here, you see a work by a Tibetan American artist named Paulden Weinreb, who was actually among the alumni of Skidmore College. He was an art student at Skidmore College, but grew up in New York City. And he's created a series of works out of, these are encaustic works made out of wax that are illuminated from within by LED lights that are, of course, references to the stupa form. And Paulden's work is really interesting, again, in taking this architectural shape, taking this architectural form, and creating it in completely different materials and with a totally different effect than you would see in these different areas. So again, demonstrating a continuity to the past along with this innovation in new constructions of them. So here's an illuminated one. This is at the Rubin Museum of Art. May it rest in peace. It's no longer open, but this was installed there. The last area that I want to address is the human body. And here, of course, the body is not an ordinary human, but the body of an awakened human, the Buddha, that melts away. And this is a topic that has a long history in Tibetan art, portraiture of great lamas, great saints in various ways. And contemporary artists have engaged in portraiture in different ways. This is a photograph of the artist Gonka Gyatso in his studio. And you can see he's going through all kinds of magazines. He does a lot of work with collage, a lot of work with stickers, and he's working on these different things. This is a series called My Identity from 2003, where Gonka Gyatso created self-portraits that he staged very meticulously and in very elaborate ways, examining different aspects of his own identity. The first one here, number one, is very clearly modeled on a famous photograph of an artist named Tsering Dundrup, who was the court painter for the 13th Dalai Lama. And he was photographed in 1937 by an American explorer named Charles Sudam Cutting. And this photograph is a very famous one. And Gonka Gyatso has sort of recreated that in his identity as a traditional Thangka painter, modeled on that one. In the next one, here, he's in a space where he's wearing the uniform of a Red Guard. And of course, painting Mao instead of painting a Buddha. Gonka Gyatso grew up in a family that adhered to Communist Party positions. He was raised in a very Chinese and communist manner. He was educated in painting in Beijing in Fine Arts Academy. And so this is referring to his sort of youth and childhood as a Tibetan communist and his training in Chinese socialist realist painting. He then left for India, and this is a sort of image of a Tibetan painter in exile, this sort of corrugated aluminum dwelling that was common in the Tibetan refugee communities, a photograph of the Dalai Lama, which of course would not have been allowed in Tibet itself. And the painting is a sort of nationalist image of the Potala Palace with the Dalai Lama above it. And the Bangla is indicating, there he is in India. And then finally, here he is in a studio in London with the tattoo that says Tibet on his arm, but making an abstract painting in a sort of minimalist London flat and showing these. And Gonka Gyatso said about this piece, he described it as sort of the culmination of a long struggle to understand his own identity. And he said, in London, I made my peace with this, meaning with this struggle, and realized that in fact, there is no pure Tibetan identity. I'm just this guy. I have Chinese inside me. I have Western influences inside me. So I'm just this hybrid Tibetan guy. I think this series really powerfully explores that. The representation of Tibetans in portraiture that Gonka Gyatso explored in many ways is responding to the work of outsiders who depicted Tibetans. This is a famous series by the Chinese painter Chen Danjing, The Sheep Herder and Going to Town. Here, The Sheep Herder is a clear reference to this work by Tsewang Tashi, who was a part of the same movement as Gonka Gyatso of artists in 2008 called Shangri-La, that sort of reimagines this encounter and is based on photographic work that he did in 2008. These are paintings by that same artist, Tsewang Tashi, that really powerfully break through the sort of romanticization and objectification of the Tibetan body as a sort of exotic, decorative element in the realist paintings that we see of outsiders representing Tibetans. This close-up, he took photographs and manipulated them digitally on computers and then made paintings based on those. Tsewang Tashi, when he talked about this series, talked about it as sort of helping him break free from the feeling that he had to paint clearly Tibetan themes and recognizing that whatever he painted would be Tibetan, and that he wanted to be appreciated as a painter along with all of the other painters in the world and not just pigeonholed as understanding Tibetan identity in one small way. There's the painter in front of one of these paintings from that series. Finally, I wanted to highlight the work of a young Tibetan artist named Nima Droma, who's trained as a fashion designer. She brought about a really interesting intervention in the Pitt Rivers Museum in England, which has this amazing ethnographic collection, but is maybe the most obviously sort of colonial of all museums in this collection of works. So she had a residency there where Claire Harris works, the author of the book I mentioned previously, and did a series of photographs of friends of hers that were double portraits that were hung inside the Pitt Rivers Museum on these huge banners. And they sort of interrupted expectations about Tibetan identity. So here's a double portrait of a friend, Tsering Dondrup, one in so-called traditional clothes and one in more modern clothes. And these are self-portraits of Nima Droma. Here she casts herself as a photographer in more traditional clothing, and here as she is today. So these are really wonderful works. They were part of a series called Performing Tibetan Identities, and there's a lot online about that series that I encourage you to look at. Finally, the last thing I just want to show is an installation that's up right now at the Museo d'Arte Orientale in Turin in Italy, And this is by Ritu Saran and Tenzin Sona, a couple who are mostly known as filmmakers in India. And this is a statue from the famous Tibetan monastery of Densitil that was part of that collection. And right now there's an installation that they created that gives voice to this figure, this guardian of art. So I just want to play this quickly and then we'll conclude. Hopefully you can read the text at the bottom. It's a translation of what's being spoken. So the artist worked with Tibetan musicians and gave voice to this protector, telling its own story of how it was removed from Tibet and how it ended up in the museum where it's located. And I see this as again, a powerful intervention in the way that Tibetan art is often framed and represented by these contemporary artists. The last images here are returning to Gade's Ice Buddha. When we were curating the show at Skidmore College, I wrote to Gade and asked if we might recreate the Ice Buddha in our own location. And he very generously shipped a mold to us with instructions for how to do it. And Saratoga Springs, where I live and where the college is located, is famous for its sacred waters. So we made an ice Buddha out of waters from the springs and documented it melting into that, which led to all kinds of logistical complications I had never imagined I would be dealing with. But we got these beautiful images. And then we also made one that we had at an event, the closing celebration for the exhibition in the gallery. You can see it melting there. And this whole project raised fascinating questions for me about meaning across spaces. What happens when you take this work, Ice Buddha, and recreate it outside of Tibet with different waters and in different locations, whether you do it outside or inside. We created a platform that would gather all of the water as it melted. And one interesting event that occurred after this melted, the next day when we went back to the museum, it had completely melted, but the water is so rich in minerals that there were these bright yellow deposits, like these little deposits left over. And they reminded me of what Tibetans call ringsel, this relics after the cremation of a sacred image. So we carefully packaged those up and sent them to Gade in Tibet as a relic of that collaboration together. So that felt very meaningful. I took a bit longer than I planned, and I want to make sure there's some time for questions. I'll just conclude by saying that hopefully this brief introduction to the work of a few different contemporary Tibetan artists, if nothing else, has introduced the richness of the work being made by Tibetans in Tibet and all over the world, and pushes against some of the assumptions that are often repeated about the end of Tibetan culture, in a sense. And in fact, that's still vibrant, ongoing. That's demonstrated by the Tibetan community here in Minneapolis. But all of these continuities between the traditional forms of Tibetan art and the works of these Tibetan artists to me, fills me with inspiration and hope that despite the extraordinary challenges and difficulties, Tibetans continue to create works about the landscape, about their architecture, and about their identities in different embodiments, even today. So thanks so much.
I think we have time for some question. I just ask that you raise your hand and wait for the mic to arrive so we can all hear your questions.
You had one female artist, and so I'm wondering if two. What else are female Tibetans doing as far as art?
Yeah, so there are many female Tibetan artists. There was a very important show in Lhasa organized of entirely female Tibetan artists. So Daedrun, who I showed an image of, and Nimadroma both participated in that. One of the most sort of exciting Tibetan art movements in Lhasa right now is run by some young Tibetan women. So a lot of the themes that are being explored here have been explored by those artists as well. And there certainly are some Tibetan artists whose work is more explicitly feminist in the sense that's more concerned with the role of Tibetan women. And we could easily do an entire lecture entirely on Tibetan women artists. So there are a couple represented here, and a very, very important part of the contemporary Tibetan art world,
for sure. My name is Tenzin, another Tenzin.
Yeah.
So, Professor Bogin, thank you so much for so beautifully presenting to us how we can actually understand a particular nation, community, and also the human beings part and how they relate to this whole gamut of things happening to this particular culture or nation. One thing that struck me was really how you juxtapose all these different themes that you presented as you were going through different section of arts, if you will. And I was thinking about from the forms of awakening, which has a very direct relationship with Tibetan Buddhist or just Buddhism in general, philosophy and concepts, to you sum it up with Tibetan identity. And then in there's a nostalgic feeling, connection to landscape, Tibet landscape, cultural transformation, but then also there's a cultural rupture. But then we also have these old artists connecting not only to the landscape, but also to a figure like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Mm-hmm. And somehow I was just wondering if you happen to have any information or data from all the informants that you work with, is there any level of cultural cognitive dissonance where you almost feel like you are the protector or beholder of some of those key Buddhist concepts of compassion and love and altruism, yet at the same time, you're seeing your culture being almost going to the trajectory of never be same as it used to be, and you constantly need to go with the flow of change. And I was wondering if there's anything that you picked up and you want to share with us in addition to everything that you shared today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a wonderful question and a very difficult one to answer. So I'll do my best. But I think there are so many conversations. I'm sure you've had yourself about the fine line between preserving a culture and maintaining the life and evolution of a culture. Right? Cultures are not fixed or frozen. In order to be alive, they have to change and develop over time, right? So as part of the exhibition, I invited some Tibetan musicians to perform. And we had at one point two different great musicians who are experts in jamnyen, the kind of Tibetan lute. One, Daejung, is trained at the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts, and he's really interested in preserving like traditional Tibetan forms of music. The other, Tenzin Chogyal, who lives now in Australia, he kind of learned to play drumlin himself, hanging out with hippies in Dharamsala, and like, you know, is really innovative in the way that he approaches the instrument and plays. And hearing the two of them discuss their relationship to this musical tradition, the relationship to it, they both have enormous respect for one another and see the work that each one is doing as really equally important to continuing and preserving these cultural traditions. I remember also the great Tibetan writer and intellectual Jamgon Norbu saying, if we just, you know, hold on to everything as it was in 1959, then it's like butterfly collectors who have to kill the butterfly in order to preserve it, you know? Like Tibetan culture cannot just be what we imagined it was in the 1950s, right? It has to continue to develop and grow. And so these artists are all doing these things in different ways, but to me, they're all sort of struggling with that balance between what does it mean to be true to your, you know, Tibetan identity, and what does it mean to be a human in the contemporary world and expressing things, you know, freely and not ignoring the fact that we're all interconnected in so many different ways now, right? And so I don't know if that answers your question, but okay, sure.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the material usage for the paintings, especially like the demoness, because I feel like the form is very clearly connected to the form of Tibetan books.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if they're drawing on the traditions of like papers and the mineral pigments that were used in tankas as well.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Very astute question. So Gade has a whole series of works that are on handmade paper and are referencing the sort of traditional material of Tibetan bookmaking and handmade paper. So that demoness is just one example, but there's a whole series of works, and you can see a lot of those online. And so he does use handmade paper, but doesn't typically use the mineral pigment paints on those. And even uses elements of collage and different things like that. So, but this experimentation with traditional materials and then mixing them with more modern materials and techniques is something that a lot of these artists explore. It's another sort of through line that I see through a lot of their works. Absolutely.
Thank you for a really wonderful presentation, and sort of in the theme of sort of transformations or movements through time. What are two or three important elements that move into Buddhist Tibet that were pre-Buddhist Tibet, since we see the goddess being captured by Buddhism and the 13 temples? What are some of the threads that moved through and into then contemporary art at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so one of the things that story about the demoness is that none of the versions of the story, there are many different versions, but none of them say that she's killed in any way. Right? She's very much alive. She's just now sort of tamed or controlled by Buddhism, right? And so it's this idea that she's still very much alive, and it is in fact the power of her own presence in the Tibetan landscape that animates the Buddhist sites, right? So Tibetan Buddhism is really a meeting of these pre-Buddhist traditions of the sacred landscape of Tibet, and then the Buddhist teachings of emptiness and compassion and wisdom brought together, right? So in terms of what sort of continues on, all of these elements that have to do with the landscape, these different ideas, that's something that goes back to the very earliest material we have available to us about Tibetan civilization, right? It's long before Buddhism arrived. As I was trying to suggest, I think even these contemporary artists who are dealing with landscape are still connected to that tie to the landscape. So that would be the first place I would think of right away.
Hello, Professor. My name is Tsawang. I'm a Tibetan community member here. I personally would like to thank you so much. In addition to what Tenzin said, thank you so much. And it almost felt like you were a true voice for Tibetans. Um, I deeply appreciate that. Um, my other question was, did you ever visit Tibet? And what do you think overall? What's your impression? You know, we as Tibetans, we always, we think ourselves as people who are struggling, and we are hoping that there'll be some solution. Of course, the main concern is the culture and the environment. Political freedom is another matter. I would also add to your presentation about Songtsen Gampo's Chinese queen. My family come from Eastern Tibet, and I was fortunate to be able to visit there once. We call it Chikudo, but now Chinese call it Yushu. And there, the path where the princess was traveled from China to Lhasa, it went through my ancestral land, and they do have a temple there in her honor. So that I just wanted to share that. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words. I have been fortunate to travel to Tibet. I haven't been in quite a long time, but from 1993 was my first visit as a student. I was 18 years old, and I went and for the first time in 1993, and I hitchhiked from Lhasa to Kangrimshe, to Mount Kailash, and did the pilgrimage there. And then I made many trips after that, mostly leading study abroad programs for college students from different American colleges, or high school students even at one point. But in terms of what I've seen there, you know, over the years from 1993 until, you know, the last time I was in Lhasa, I think was in the early 2000s, it became, you know, more and more difficult to feel much hope in the urban areas, I found. But when I was able to travel to less populated areas, and particularly like in Jikundo and in Kham, areas outside of the Xizang province or Tibetan Autonomous Region in Sichuan province of China, or the east, regulations were a little less tight, and I was amazed to see, you know, rebuilding of monasteries, of temples, people doing long retreats up in mountains, and the ability of Tibetan communities to continue with their traditions, to remain resilient in the face of such oppression, has been an ongoing source of amazement, really, and inspiration to me in a lot of those areas in Eastern Tibet. I've also been to a number of places where people say, oh, this is where Wenqing came on this route. And I think there was one scholar who tried to map you know, her travels based on temples that say she traveled there. And either she went like this, or there are many different versions, many different accounts. Of course, this is going back to the 7th century, so who knows? But it is so fascinating to see how these stories remain alive even today in a lot of these areas that go back to them.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a short question and then a potential follow-up. So would you identify yourself as Tibetan personally, or have any connection? Like, no?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, I ask because I'm going on a study abroad trip soon to Chile, and I'm going to do some research there, and I'm wondering how, as somebody who is not Tibetan, you go about ethically researching and curating and sharing these stories without overtaking actual Tibetan voices, and just
Yeah,
trying to go about that in an ethical way?
that's a really great question, and I applaud you for asking that question. You know, when I was a student in the '90s, I think a lot of us had this idea we're gonna like free Tibet, we're gonna save Tibet, and you know, and it was a part of sort of our identities. Incredibly naive, there was an aspect to it that really did not make room for Tibetan voices, and that took over. And I think my students, you know, the college students I teach these days are much more aware of that, much more cautious about cultural appropriation, much more careful about it. But there is a danger, I think, sometimes of going too far, where it becomes almost like impossible to enter into another cultural space because you're so afraid of overstepping. And so I think trying to find a balance, and the fact that you're asking that question is a good sign, right? That you're already concerned about it. But don't let your concerns about that prevent you from entering into Chilean culture as fully as you possibly can. And you have to remember, like when I first did the study abroad program as a student and was living with a Tibetan family in India, I was like an infant there. I didn't know how to sit properly, how to eat properly, how to talk properly. So it can be very, very humbling, and that's, you know, very powerful. To this day, I'm so grateful for the host family that I lived with, that they had the patience to put up with my terrible manners and my, you know, ineptitude, and the kindness that they showed. And you know, I think if you show an interest, a genuine interest in learning about Chilean culture, people will appreciate that so deeply, right? And if you go with the goal of listening, learning, you know, trying to fit into that as best as possible, then people will appreciate that so deeply, right? Especially they're used to foreigners coming in as kind of tourists looking for like getting the right selfie to put on social media in the right place, and you know, or doing some do good project just to feel good about themselves without actually paying attention to what people really need. That happens all the time, all over the place. So if you actually are sort of genuine about learning and listening, I think you can't go wrong, really. I mean, people really appreciate that. So that's in my experience.
Does the demoness represent bone?
That's a complicated question. I would say we shouldn't really think of it in those terms, right? Because bone, you know, really developed in as Bon as we recognize it today in conversation with Buddhism. And there's so much mutual influence back and forth between those two traditions in different ways. And I don't think that it would be correct to imagine that the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet was Bön, right? The word Bön was used to refer to some of the pre-Buddhist priests in Tibet, but that religion that existed in Tibet was as influential in Bön as it was in Buddhism as they developed later. So the scholar R.A. Stein used to refer to it as the nameless religion because we don't have any written texts from that time. Written language in Tibet came with Buddhism, right? So it's very difficult to really know what the religion was like, but I think we should be careful not to confuse the category of Bön as it developed over time with the religion that existed before Buddhism came. But there's certainly connections, you know, in both.
All right, one more right here. I've been waiting, holding this in. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and the work that you've done. My question is, or I guess a thought for reflection for everybody, and maybe for you included, is how much of the refugee experience with a lot of these artists being in different parts of the world have influenced their through maybe communication with you or the works that you have interacted with them, have made them recognize that diaspora and resettling into a different country and try to hold your identity together. How much of that do you see in like the work that they've done in communication with you that holds true to everybody's own, maybe like family bloodline who came to this country in America, as well as those that are in a refugee status, moving to different parts of the world. And in that Tibetan identity, what do you feel like is the connection these artists made in that whole diaspora?
Yeah, that may be a good question to leave as the final word on that. I wouldn't dare to answer it, but I thank you for that question. And it's definitely a theme that artists, Tibetan artists outside of Tibet, are all wrestling with. And I think it's interesting in some ways the Tibetans in Tibet are in similar ways. They feel like outsiders in their own country often, right? Although they're not necessarily refugees in the technical sense of having left their homeland, as particularly the urban areas have become more and more Chinese, they feel like, in a sense, a similar experience, I think, to what the refugees feel elsewhere. We're a bit over time, but thank you all so much for these wonderful questions and for your attention today. I appreciate it very much.